Ty, najbardziej kontrowersyjna teoria Dark Souls. Co to jest?
Have you heard of the God of the Gaps fallacy? It's the idea that gaps in scientific knowledge are evidence for God's existence. We don't know where consciousness came from? God. We don't know what happened before the Big Bang? God. You can't help buying
Ty,
all...
a jakby tak teoretyczny materiał lorowy brzmiał z dubbingiem AI?
Od kupowania wszystkich tych skórek i rywali
Ja pierdolę, no nie. Nie da się tego słuchać.
skins and Marvel rivals? That's not a lack of personal responsibility. It's God making you that way. Now, I bring this up because the Dark Souls franchise has its own version of this exact problem. Though there are many gods in the Dark Souls pantheon, none fit this role better than Velka. We don't know who Gwyn's
Welka.
wife
Kojarzę, były jakieś itemy Welki chyba. Jakaś czapka czy coś?
was. Velka. We don't know the Witch of Isolith's name. Velka. That giant skull in Ash Lake? No, it's not the blacksmith god. Who gave it's Velka! To be fair, it's not completely unreasonable to make all of these assumptions. Aside from maybe the G-Man from Half-Life, Velka might be the most mysterious character I've ever encountered in a video game. She's never introduced in a cutscene, never explained through dialogue, and never given some dramatic boss fight monologue where she enters the arena and says, "I am Velka, goddess of 1,000 unhinged Reddit threads." Instead, everything we know about her comes strictly through item descriptions and
O
environment.
właśnie, Mask of Welka, patrzcie. No to kojarzyłem ten item. Ale kurwa, widzisz, Miyazaki lubi zostawiać dziury. To jest to, co on mówił w wielu wywiadach, że jego filozofia zaczęła się poprzez czytanie książek, które nie zawsze były dostępne po japońsku, więc czytał po angielsku, którego aż tak nie rozumiał języka, więc musiał sobie dużo części historii dopowiadać. Cały czas w grach zostawia właśnie takie dziury, żeby ludzie też sobie mogli, tak jak on, co mu sprawiało dużo satysfakcji za dzieciaka, dopowiadać te historie.
Environmental details. And unfortunately, those details are painfully few in number. But with the few snippets we get, they make her seem impossibly important, which in turn leads to the logic leaps. Velka is associated...
Mnie już przeraża, ile tak naprawdę elementów on pokazał. Jakieś kurde posągi, nie posągi, których ja nigdy nie widziałem, nigdy nie zwracałem na nie uwagi. Jak grasz w Soulsy, to tylko myślisz o tym, co tutaj zapierdolić, nie? A jednak Miyazaki lubi z ekipą opowiadać otoczeniem. Jakkolwiek by ono nie wyglądało, jakkolwiek jakościowe, graficznie by ono nie było, to jednak dużo jest elementów i nic nie jest z przypadku, byleby coś wypełnić.
with dark. Therefore, she is the furtive pygmy, or the furtive pygmy's wife. She is associated with crows, so that crow at the undead asylum is literally Velka. Where almost every miracle scales with the faith stat, Velka's talisman lets miracles scale with intelligence. The only other character's magic who does something similar is Gwendolyn, and they both had something to do with the Blades of the Dark Moon, so Velka is secretly Gwendolyn. After many years, the many theories surrounding Velka have become so numerous, convoluted, and overextended that any time her name is mentioned, the Dark Souls fan community collectively rolls their eyes. That is why any theory surrounding her immediately becomes the most controversial. When one person sees a genuine pattern that helps explain her, another person will see a giant conspiracy board, and both might have a point. My goal with this video is to try and set the record straight as much as possible. What do we know for sure about Velka? What can be reasonably inferred?
Czyli właśnie będziemy oglądać materiał o najbardziej tajemniczej postaci w historii Dark Souls. Dawaj.
What theories are actually well-founded, and where does Velka become the god of the gaps? Before I get into all of that, remember to hit the like button. That helps me out a ton. And if you like the type of in-depth analysis that I do here, please consider checking out my Patreon page or my YouTube membership section, where you can get certain perks like early access to my videos. I will leave links to both in the description box below.
Dobra, co wiemy na pewno?
Velka is the goddess of sin. Her role in the hierarchy of gods is to define sin and mete out the appropriate punishment. But in the spirit of justice, Velka and her followers do not strictly dole out punishment, but allow for the possibility of mercy, confession, and absolution. In the time of the Dark Souls games, this role was taken up by Velka's pardoners, including Oswald the Pardoner in Dark Souls 1, and later echoed by figures like Cromwell the Pardoner in Dark Souls 2. Velka's authority is also tied to the Book of the Guilty, which records the names of sinners, specifically those who disrespected the gods or their covenants. And those listed in the book would eventually be hunted by the Blades of the Dark Moon, an organization headed by Gwendolyn. While it is unclear whether Velka was directly involved in the Blades' chain of command, her Book of the Guilty was nonetheless part of the machinery that allowed the Dark Moon to identify and punish the guilty. Some of the strongest believers and enforcers of Velka's will originate in the country of Kareem. The aforementioned Oswald is explicitly from Kareem, and sells many items associated with Velka, including the Book of the Guilty. Though she was revered in Kareem, she is generally viewed less favorably within the hierarchy of gods. In the English translation of the Vow of Silence miracle, Velka is referred to as a rogue deity. However, there is a stronger nuance that Dark Souls fans have pointed out in the original Japanese text.
I to jest kurwa ciekawe. Często jest tak, że coś w tłumaczeniu się zatraca. Że jakaś część loru, kurde, po japońsku zupełnie inaczej wygląda.
Which suggests that the word that was translated to rogue might be closer to the word heretical. This might be at least partially due to the nature of her magic. As I said a moment ago, her talisman lets miracles scale with intelligence, where in almost any other circumstance, they scale with faith. Despite this and likely other heretical practices, Velka nonetheless maintained, quote, an unusually wide influence within the realm of gods.
No dobra, czyli mamy boginię, której ludzie tak naprawdę zawierzają, egzekwują jej wolę i szukają winnych, karają winnych według jej rozumowania, tak? Według tej księgi, Księga Winnych.
The places where Velka had the biggest influence in the Dark Souls games appear to be the painted world of Ariamis in Dark Souls 1, and to a lesser extent, the painted world of Ariandel in Dark Souls 3. Ariamis is where the direct Velka evidence is strongest. It includes Velka's rapier, her miracle, the Vow of Silence, and the black set of robes worn by her pardoners. With Ariandel, it's a bit more complicated. One of the sisters of the Sable Church of Londor, Frida, resides within the painted world of Ariandel. Londor itself contains Velka-adjacent material, like the aforementioned Vow of Silence and the Ring of Sacrifice. The most important element that is consistent between both painted worlds is the inclusion of crows and the crow-human hybrids known as Corvians. The definitive evidence in favor of this comes from the Dark Souls Design Works book, where series creator Hidetaka Miyazaki says that the birdmen in the painted world were worshippers of Velka, and their bodies were warped due to that devotion. This connection.
Czekaj, czyli normalnie to byli ludzie, no albo jakieś istoty humanoidalne totalnie, które zdeformowały się przez oddanie. Czyli kruk jest totalną symboliką Welki, tak? Trochę jak Odyn, kurwa, z mitologii.
Seems to echo into the Corvians found in the painted world of Ariandel and the main world of Dark Souls 3, as suggested by the descriptions of the storyteller's staff and the great Corvian scythe, both of which reference the painted world and Velka's signature trait of heresy. So even when Velka's name mostly disappeared from the world of Dark Souls by the time of the third game, the ecosystem remains. Crows, painted worlds, and heresy.
Dobra.
One of the most
racjonalne.
reasonable inferences that Dark Souls fans have made about Velka is that she had a motive to prosecute Lord Gwyn. For anybody who needs a refresher, Gwyn violated the natural succession of the world. The Age of Fire was supposed to fade with the Age of Dark taking its place. Humanity, which had always been tied to the Dark, was supposed to inherit this age. But Gwyn rejected the natural state of affairs and chose to prolong the Age of Fire through the linking of the flame. This act was subsequently referred to as the First Sin. Given that Velka's divine function is to define sin and mete out punishment, and Gwyn's committing of the first sin sits at the center of the entire trilogy,
czyli Gwyn był tak naprawdę pierwszym grzesznikiem.
It makes perfect sense that she would not only care, but have reason to involve.
To jest ciekawe, ile tutaj też zbieżności z fabułą Eldena widzimy, bo Miyazaki próbuje podobną historię opowiedzieć wiele razy. Tam też mamy pewien stan rzeczy, który jest totalnie zaburzany i zmieniany przez nadejście wyższej woli i wyznaczenie tam swoich wasali, mariki i tak dalej, i tak dalej. Przeciekawe to jest. Tutaj też były pewne zasady świata, które przez Gwyna zostały zaburzone.
herself in fixing the natural cycle. This is where several of Velka's associations start to matter. First, she
Świat
has
namalowany z DS3 to Elden. Jest taka teoria, że te wszystkie uniwersa są ze sobą połączone. Można kiedyś coś obejrzeć na ten temat.
deep ties to the dark, and by proxy, humanity. The presence of her statues in New Londo and the Painted Worlds feels appropriate for this reason. Both are places historically tied
Dzięki,
to
Memciu.
humans, and after Gwyn committed the first sin, those same humans became cursed as undead. Therefore, Velka's image appears in spaces haunted by the very things who suffered most from Gwyn's original crime. New Londo is one of, if not the first place, that those on the side of dark started rebelling against Gwyn. The rebellion was in part influenced by the primordial serpent Darkstalker Koth, who taught the denizens of New Londo the power of life drain. This would enable them to preserve their humanity even while undead. New Londo's continued fraternization with Koth eventually led to the opening of the Abyss, which Gwyn and his order felt so threatened by that they decided to flood the city. However, this wasn't the end of humanity's attempts to rise up against Gwyn's tyranny. The item descriptions for the effigy shield and the Dark Ember suggest that there was a plot to destroy the gods by followers of the occult. This information makes Velka suspicious once again, because in Dark Souls, occult power is not dark magic, but a contradiction of terms. To create an occult weapon in the first Dark Souls, you first ascend a divine weapon to +5, then use the Dark Ember to transform that divine weapon into an occult weapon. This implies that the occult is a union of opposites, of light and dark, which would parallel Velka's magical tendencies, what with the scaling of miracles with the opposite stat of intelligence. And let's not forget
Niesamowite, że nawet z craftingu możesz wnioski lore'owe wyciągnąć, kurwa. I oczywiście tu zawsze będzie się pojawiała dyskusja o tym, czy to nie jest nadinterpretacja, ale dalej pojebane.
that the only place you can find the Dark Ember
Pasuje.
is the place where Velka's influence is felt most, the Painted World of Ariamis. So if Velka had motive to prosecute Gwyn, had ties to humanity and the undead, and had ties to occult power, the next question becomes obvious. Did Velka simply object to Gwyn's sin, or did she actively help bring about his punishment? Those who would suggest the latter possibility will certainly invoke the Chosen Undead prophecy, in which the player becomes the main participant. When we are transported to Lordran from the Undead Asylum, this act is done by a giant crow. Given Velka's association with crows, that is suspicious.
O kurwa.
Not only that, in order to enter
No
the
właśnie, ty. Skoro kruki są z nią związane i kruk nas przynosi na miejsce, to może jesteśmy sami nieświadomie osobą egzekwującą wolę Welki. Welka rozkmynka.
Painted World of Ariamis in the first place, we have to take the crow back to the Undead Asylum to find the peculiar doll item which acts as a key to the Painted World. With this said though, this is not undeniable proof that Velka is playing an active role at the time of the first game. In addition, it's not proof, as some fans have suggested, that Velka created the Chosen Undead prophecy, that she controlled the Chosen Undead, or that she is the very crow transporting you. Nonetheless, it shows that Velka's symbolism sits suspiciously close to the Chosen Undead's journey. In the second and third game, that presence becomes much harder to detect, but Velka's fingerprints are nonetheless present. In the area of Brightstone Cove Saldora in Dark Souls 2,
Dark Souls 2.
there is a chapel featuring a statue of a robed woman, whom fans have speculated to be Velka. They have also proposed that the book in her right hand is the Book of the Guilty, and the lock of hair in her left hand is her hair-based talisman. The
No kurwa, dziwny zbieg okoliczności. W sumie. Bardzo dziwny.
possibility that this is Velka is strengthened by the presence of Cromwell the Pardoner in the room sitting above the chapel. For a town based around
Wyżej jest
forbidden
Pardoner.
knowledge and power, having a statue dedicated to Velka there feels appropriate. Finally, we have the Sable Church of Londor in Dark Souls 3. To be clear, there is no definitive evidence to suggest that Londor or the Sable Church is run by Velka. The biggest influence seems to stem from the three sisters Frida, Liliane, and Yuria, who appear to be influenced by the aforementioned Darkstalker Koth. That said, there are a number of elements that feel suspiciously Velka adjacent. The most obvious example is the presence of the statue that fans have assumed to be Velka in the Ariandel Chapel, which is occupied by the aforementioned Frida. Next is the Vow of Silence miracle. In Dark Souls 1, Vow of Silence was Velka's secret rite, but in Dark Souls 3, that exact miracle is now described as a miracle of the Sable Church. At minimum, this implies that Londor has inherited or absorbed one of...
Kurwa, o ilu rzeczach ten Miyazaki myśli? Nie, no to jest zbyt duży zbieg okoliczności. No na pewno to było tak przekminione, ale jednak to się łączy.
Velka's signature spells. This is reinforced by the Ring of Sacrifice. In both Dark Souls 1 and 3, the ring is explicitly tied to Velka's sacrificial rites, but in Dark Souls 3, it is sold by Yuria. The reasonable inference here is not that Velka was the secret Pope of Londor. In my opinion, Koth appears to be the primary ideological force, but Velka's influence appears to linger in the methods Londor uses.
Dobra, najpopularniejsze teorie. No to już odlatujemy trochę.
If we assume that these statues in the Painted Worlds and New Londo depict
No to
Velka,
pasuje.
then the next question becomes obvious. Who is the child standing beside her? One possibility is that the child represents humanity itself, especially the undead and other forlorn souls to whom Velka, through the Painted Worlds, may have offered refuge. The other more popular possibility, and the one that I personally subscribe to, is that the child is Priscilla. Aside from Velka,
Ale
no
czemu?
character is more
No w sumie
central
dobra, ona się znajduje akurat w namalowanym świecie i to totalnie związanym z Welką, więc teoretycznie miałoby to sens.
to the mystery of the Painted World than Priscilla. Not only is she present in the first game, there is also a statue inside the Ariandel Chapel that is generally assumed to be her, particularly because one can find an illustration of this statue in the Dark Souls 3 art book, and the shawl that this statue
O kurwa.
depicts is quite similar to the one that Priscilla wears in the first game. Now, another theory
Nie no,
that is
przekminy na bazie artbooka to się nie spodziewałem.
generally accepted in the Dark Souls community is that because Priscilla is referred to as a crossbreed, her father was likely Seath the Scaleless. Her white, draconic features make this a safe assumption. Though the identity of her mother is unconfirmed, the evidence that is available points toward Velka. The most obvious pieces of evidence are Priscilla's
Dobra, czyli
dagger,
Welka się puściła z Sifem tylko. Czy w takim razie coś z Sifa da się wykminić?
which is one of the few occult weapons that one can find in the game.
Aha, no i kurwa jej broń jeszcze jest okultem. O, to ciekawe.
And Priscilla's life hunt ability, a power feared by Gwyn and the other gods. This is a trait that would benefit Velka and the people she theoretically defended if they were to form some sort of rebellion.
I kurwa, broń ma efekt Life Hunta, którego bał się Gwyn, a Gwyn był ścigany przez Welkę, potencjalnie. Nie no, Miyazaki ty chory pojebie.
Aside from this, there are a couple of other really obscure pieces of evidence that I need to credit a fellow lore enthusiast, Loki Souls, for introducing me to. The first argument that Loki makes in favor of Seath and Velka being Priscilla's parents is the character of Ornifex from Dark Souls 2. She is a descendant of the Corvian lineage that traces itself back to the Painted World of Ariamis, and she is also located in Brightstone Cove, Sildora, just like Cromwell. In the game, Ornifex serves as a blacksmith that is able to transmute boss souls into weapons. What is curious is how she said she learned these techniques.
It is said that our technique originates from a strange being that inhabited this land. A pale beast that lived long
O
ago.
kurwa.
We don't even know what exactly it was.
There are other beasts in the series that one could refer to as pale, but within the context of Brightstone Cove, a land saturated with the legacy of Seath's experiments, Seath seems overwhelmingly to be the intended reference. Somehow, Seath's soul-crafting knowledge entered the Velka-associated traditions of the Corvians. Though granted, this does not prove in and of itself that Priscilla is Seath and Velka's child. The second piece of evidence, however, does more to support this theory.
Dawaj.
In the Ringed City DLC for Dark Souls 3, we encounter a character named Shira, who describes herself as, quote, the progeny of a god and the daughter of a duke.
Duke.
As far as we know, there are only two characters who are given the title of Duke in the Dark Souls series, Duke Seldora and Seath. And as we have already established with Seldora, his Brightstone Cove is very much associated with Seath and Velka. Not to mention his dear Freya drops the old Pale Drake soul in New Game Plus, which is a direct reference to Seath. And for good measure, the name Shira might be a rewriting of the
Niesamowite, że nawet tak inna gra jak Dark Souls 2 robiona przez inną drużynę, jakby nie patrzeć, w dużej mierze jest spójna
Japanese Shiro,
z tym
which
wszystkim
translates
fabularnie.
to white, another reference to Seath. But while that solves the Seath side of the equation, what does Velka have to do with Shira? When Shira says that she is the progeny of a god, Loki theorizes that that god would be Guinevere, daughter of Gwyn. He cites two pieces of evidence in favor of this interpretation. First, the Japanese translation for Seath's soul shard suggests that when Seath became Gwyn's duke, he also became a Gaiseki. In Japanese, that word suggests that Seath became royal kin by marrying into Gwyn's family. Out of all of Gwyn's progeny that we are aware of, the most likely candidate would be Guinevere. If this reading is correct, then Priscilla may be an illicit child born outside that royal union, possibly with Velka. The second piece of evidence supports this notion. The English translation for Priscilla's soul describes her as a bastard child, but the Japanese translation uses the terms fugi noko, which can imply that Priscilla was a child of immorality, illegitimacy, or infidelity. That would explain why Priscilla was hidden in the Painted World, because there she would be under the protection of her true mother. It would also suggest that Guinevere's later departure from Anor Londo and marriage to Flan the Fire God was part of that fallout. While I believe that this is the strongest argument regarding Priscilla's identity and Velka's involvement with the gods, there is the matter of the
Kurwa,
other
wiecie,
mother...
niektóre teorie brzmią jak naciągane, nie? Ale tu się jakoś wszystko zgrywa. Co jest? Wiesz co, bym chciał kiedyś zobaczyć? Taki cykl Miyazaki ogląda i tam 150 odcinków właśnie tak jak ogląda takie filmy, jak ogląda filmy od Watiego itp. itd. I na ile ludzie faktycznie wykminili, a ile to nasza wyobraźnia. Jezu, gdyby Miyazaki tak kurwa rozwiał te wszystkie wątpliwości, no ale to chyba straciłoby swoje piękno, nie? Właśnie, kurde, to jest najlepsze, że ludzie mogą sobie kminić.
Statues found throughout Lordran.
Niesamowite też jest to, że na przestrzeni lat jednak te gry się uzupełniają, nie? Że Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3 dodaje kontekst do tego, co się zrodziło w Dark Souls 1. Fajne.
Given the similarity between these and the ones that decorate New Londo and the Painted World, some have theorized that not only are these Velka as well, but that they are Velka as the mother of Gwyn's children. That is entirely possible, especially when you consider Dark Souls 2 and how much of that game was constructed to parallel the characters and events of the first game. In this case, maybe Nashandra marrying King Vendrick was meant to parallel Velka marrying Gwyn. To be honest, I used to believe this theory, until I asked why Gwyn would marry someone whose entire identity was bound up with humanity and the occult. Though Nashandra had the same associations with Dark that Velka did, her marriage to Vendrick makes much greater narrative sense than Velka marrying Gwyn. This does leave one last nagging question, however. Why would Seath be driven to have an affair with Velka? Before I address that question, I feel it would be best to set it up by introducing the second most popular theory about Velka, that following Dark Souls 1, she took on a new identity. Kaitha, Goddess of Tears. As the name-engraved ring from Dark Souls 2 states, long-lost gods might...
Ale to by się zgadzało, dlaczego imię Welki już w kolejnych częściach się nie pojawia, ale jednak te itemy są i dalej jakoś tam się to wszystko zgrywa itemowo i lorowo, ale jednak imię Welki jest nieobecne. To by dodało nam nowe itemy, gdyby podpiąć kolejną postać pod to.
Be known by different names after enough time passes, and there is enough evidence to suggest that Velka went through a similar evolution, mainly to escape her heretical reputation. Once again, I cite Loki's arguments in favor of this interpretation. First, just as Velka was revered in the country of Karim, Kaitha becomes one of the most revered goddesses from Karim in the second game, with her religion spreading to Lothric by the time of Dark Souls 3. Second, Kaitha's magic functions similarly to Velka's. Just as Velka's talisman casts miracles in accordance with intelligence, Kaitha's chime does the same, while also
Kurwa.
being agreeable with miracles that lean toward dark. This also helps explain why Kaitha, despite being outwardly framed as a compassionate goddess of tears, is treated with suspicion. Some descriptions suggest that she may be an evil god who guides people toward despair. That gives her the same contradictory religious character as Velka, a goddess who offers comfort, forgiveness, or mercy to the forlorn, but whose power also carries something forbidden, heretical, and dark adjacent. My favorite piece of evidence, however, comes with the miracle spell known as Caressing Prayer, a miracle that just so happens to be sold by Cromwell the Pardoner. But that's
Okay.
not what's interesting about it. As Loki points out, the menu graphic and effect for Caressing Prayer is derived from a sorcery known as Remedy from Dark Souls 1. And Remedy was a product of the sorcerers that lived in New Londo.
O
But what
kurwa,
does
i to się
Caressing
też
Prayer
wiąże.
have to do with Kaitha? In Dark Souls 3, the Caressing Prayer miracle evolves into the Caressing Tears miracle, reflecting Kaitha's namesake. That progression is fascinating. Remedy the sorcery becoming the Caressing Prayer miracle, and then becoming the Caressing Tears miracle. More than fascinating, it is quintessentially Velka, because if there is one thing that Velka's magic consistently does, it is violate the border between categories that are supposed to remain separate. So if Kaitha is Velka, maybe she was reinterpreted after centuries of religious transformation. She may be what Velka looks like when her harsher function is reinterpreted through grief. In other words, if Velka judges sin, then Kaitha mourns what sin leaves behind. And that matters because it changes the way we should understand Velka's possible relationship with Seath. Seath, after all, is one of the most broken beings in the entire mythology of Dark Souls. He was a dragon born without the rock scales that made his brethren immortal. In response, his entire existence became one long struggle to defy his fate, not just by killing his fellow brethren alongside Gwyn out of resentment, but by seeking the primordial crystal to obtain the immortality he was denied. So maybe Seath and Velka were simply drawn to each other because both were trying to transcend the order of things. Seath wanted to transcend his biological limits, and Velka wanted to restore the balance that Gwyn violated. But upon meeting each other, they realized that they could do more than that. Instead, they could transcend the broken categories that made that violation possible in the first place. And the biggest piece of evidence for this comes through a symbol that appears in places suspiciously connected to both Seath and Velka, the Caduceus. In the Duke's archives in Dark Souls 1, one can find the Caduceus kite shields, the only place that they drop in the entire game. In Dark Souls 3, one can find the Caduceus symbol on the doors of the Ariandel Chapel, which houses within the statue of Velka. Now, why does this symbol equate to transcendence? In the alchemical tradition, the Caduceus can represent two things. It symbolizes both the physical and metaphysical substance of Mercury, which is appropriate given that the Roman god Mercury was often depicted carrying a Caduceus wand. On the other hand, the Caduceus is the spirit that underlies all matter in the universe. It is the black void of space. By virtue of this, it has the power to unite elements that should be seen as irreconcilable, male and female, or sun and moon, which were often personified in alchemical texts as the gods Sol and Luna, names that should sound familiar to you Dark Souls 2 fans. However, the best example of a pair of opposites being united in the void comes with what I believe the Caduceus symbol depicts in the Dark Souls games.
No dobra, czyli jeżeli mamy te przeciwieństwa, no to znowu wiąże się z samym okultem, nie? Bo tam też było plus i minus tak naprawdę, yin i yang.
That being Darkstalker Koth and Kingseeker Frampts, primordial serpents that emerge from the same void and yet seek opposing goals. But the Caduceus suggests something different, not one serpent defeating the other, but both forces being brought back into relation.
To też jest ciekawe, że tu masz symbol dwóch tak naprawdę węży, nie? I kurwa masz tego Frampta i Kafa. I czemu to wszystko tak pasuje?
Velka is connected to that symbol, then maybe she was never simply pro-dark and thus pro-humanity. Maybe she was interested in transcending all of that, and in favor of that interpretation, I have one last piece of
To
evidence.
też jakby tak się inaczej zastanowić, to skoro Sif dążył do nieśmiertelności, ona tak naprawdę też dążyła do nieśmiertelności, ale z zasad, no bo Gwynach ścigała, chcąc go ukarać za to, że przerwał, kurwa, ten cykl, tę nieśmiertelność z zasady ognia, który miał wygasnąć, nie?
In alchemical symbolism, the
A to już
spirit
mocne
of
odwrócenie
Mercury
logiki.
was not just personified as a snake, it was also depicted as a crow.
O
If
kurwa.
Priscilla is the child of Seath, then she would be a perfect embodiment of this union of opposites. Velka is female, humanoid, and associated with the color black, the color of the chaotic abyss, which the serpentine spirit of Mercurius resides in. Seath is male, bestial, and associated with the color white. As a dragon, he represents the transmutation of that chaotic substance to its final form, from imperfect serpents to perfect dragons. Their union produced Priscilla, the union of yin and yang, male and female, beginning and end in one. Maybe Priscilla was rejected not entirely because she was born out of wedlock, but because she represented a form of existence that should be impossible, one that threatens the order imposed by the gods. And what type of existence is that? It is exactly what Aldia described at the end of Dark Souls 2. Neither light nor dark, but something else entirely. Velka isn't interesting because she can be used to explain everything. She's interesting because she appears wherever the explanation starts to break down. Despite all of this information, there is still enough reasonable doubt regarding Velka's identity, which is why I want to hear from you. Do you have a better
To jest popieprzone, jak pomyślisz o tym, że ludzie po 15 latach dalej sobie gdzieś kminią nad tymi Dark Soulsami, no bo to się z jedynki wzięło, nie? Głównie. Ja pierniczę, fajne wideo, ale kurde, wszędzie pojawiająca się postać, gdzieś tam w mniejszym lub większym stopniu, o której chuja wiadomo. No i oczywiście na koniec można by było zarzucić, Miyazaki sam nie wie, kurwa, kto to jest, se po prostu ją wymyślił, a ludzie se dorabiają teorię. Ale coś za dużo tutaj się zgrywa i pasuje.